He said I meant nothing, and somehow, that hurt less than the silence that followed. I remember the exact way the chandelier light fractured above me, scattering across the marble floor like something expensive breaking in slow motion, and I remember thinking that nothing in this room belonged to me, not the silk dress stitched to fit a life I never chose, not the ring that weighed heavier than it should on my finger, not even the name I had just taken less than an hour ago. Emily Carter was gone, replaced by something quieter, something owned, something that stood in the center of a $12 million mansion and realized too late that survival sometimes came dressed as surrender. I didn't cry when they told me I had to marry him. I didn't cry when my mother's hands shook as she signed the final document that erased our debts, and I didn't cry when the man himself, Victor Kane, walked into the room like gravity shifted to accommodate him, 65 years old, silver threading through dark hair, posture straight like he had never bent for anyone in his life. People didn't greet him, they adjusted around him, lowered their voices, straightened their shoulders, like the air itself understood its place. And I told myself I was doing this for a reason, for my brother in that hospital bed with machines breathing louder than he could, for a future that wouldn't collapse under unpaid bills and quiet desperation. I told myself I was choosing this. Even though every instinct inside me whispered that this wasn't a choice, it was a trade, and I was the currency. The ceremony passed like a blur of polite smiles and controlled whispers, no music I recognized, no vows that meant anything. Just signatures and nods and a ring sliding onto my finger like the closing of a door I didn't know how to reopen. And then came the night, the moment everyone pretends matters most, except nothing about it felt sacred. The room was too large, too quiet. The bed untouched like a display instead of something meant for real people, and when he finally spoke, standing a few feet away from me as if distance was part of the contract, his voice was calm, measured, not cruel, not kind, just absolute. You mean nothing. Don't expect anything from me, and I realized then that this wasn't going to be a story about love or even hate, it was going to be about endurance, about learning the shape of a life where you exist inside someone else's world without ever truly entering it. I should have felt small, but instead something steadied inside me, something quiet and stubborn that refused to disappear just because he said I didn't matter. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the man who could buy anything. And still chose distance over connection, and I understood something he didn't expect me to understand. Power doesn't always come from control, sometimes it comes from what you refuse to become, and that was the moment, standing barefoot on cold marble floors in a room that wasn't mine, wearing a name that didn't feel like mine, that I made a decision no one had asked for. If I meant nothing to him, then nothing was exactly what I would give him, because I didn't marry a man that night, I married a silence. And I was about to learn how loud silence could be. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid of him, but because the silence in that house felt too deliberate, like it was watching me, measuring me, deciding what I was worth, and according to him, that value was nothing. So I stayed exactly where I was long after he left the room, standing in a dress that suddenly felt too tight around my ribs, listening to the distant hum of a place that never truly rested. Somewhere down the hallway, footsteps moved in patterns that were too precise to be accidental, doors opened and closed without slamming, voices stayed low, controlled, like even sound had rules here, and I realized quickly that this was not just a home, it was a system, and I had just been placed inside it without instructions. By morning, I had not changed, had not moved much at all, but something inside me had already shifted, something that refused to break just because he expected me to bend. The sun came through the floor-to-ceiling windows in long golden lines that made everything look softer than it actually was, and for a brief second, I forgot where I was, until a quiet knock came at the door, not loud, not demanding, just certain. I turned slowly, expecting him, but it was not Victor Kane. It was a woman, maybe in her early 50s, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform that looked like it had never known a wrinkle, her posture straight, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Good morning, Mrs. Kane," she said, like the words had been rehearsed, and I almost laughed at how wrong that sounded, how foreign it felt to hear my name attached to something I never agreed to. "Breakfast will be served downstairs in 10 minutes, she added, then paused just long enough for me to understand that this was not a suggestion. I nodded, because what else was I supposed to do, and she left as quietly as she had arrived. I looked at my reflection in the mirror after she closed the door, really looked this time. my hair still pinned from the ceremony, my makeup faded but intact. My eyes the only part of me that looked different, sharper somehow, more awake, like they were already learning how to survive here. I changed into the first thing I could find in the closet, something simple, something that felt like me, even if it probably cost more than everything I owned before combined, and when I stepped into the hallway, the air felt cooler, heavier, like it carried expectations I had not agreed to. The dining room was larger than my entire apartment back home, a long table set for two, polished to the point where it reflected everything above it, and he was already there, sitting at the head like he had always belonged in that exact spot, a cup of coffee in front of him, untouched, his eyes lifting just enough to acknowledge my presence before returning to whatever thoughts occupied him. I hesitated for half a second, then walked in anyway, because standing still had never saved anyone. I took the seat across from him, the distance between us wide enough to feel intentional, a boundary drawn without words, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the quiet clink of silverware being placed by someone who disappeared as quickly as they arrived. I reached for the glass of water in front of me just to do something with my hands, and that was when he spoke again, not looking at me, not needing to. There are rules in this house, his voice calm, steady, like he was stating facts instead of making demands. You will follow them. I set the glass down slowly, meeting his gaze this time, because if I was going to exist here, I was not going to do it with my head down. And if I do not? I asked, my voice quieter than I expected, but it did not shake, not even a little. That seemed to interest him more than anything else so far, his eyes lingering for a fraction longer than before, studying, calculating. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair, not threatened, not angry, just aware. Then you will learn why everyone else does, he said, and there it was again, not a threat, not exactly, but something colder, something more certain, and instead of fear, something unexpected settled in my chest, something steady, something dangerous in its own quiet way, because for the first time since this began, I understood the rules were not just his, they were something I could choose to play with, bend, maybe even break, and that was the moment I realized I was not just trapped in his world, I was standing at the edge of it, deciding how much of myself I was willing to lose to survive it. The rest of that morning unfolded like a test I did not remember agreeing to take, every movement observed without anyone openly watching, every choice measured in ways I could not yet understand. I noticed it in the way the staff spoke to me, polite but careful, never too familiar, never too distant, like they were waiting to see which version of me would survive here, the obedient wife or the problem no one wanted to deal with. And I refused to give them either. Instead I moved slowly through the house after breakfast, not wandering, not lost, just present, letting my fingers brush against the edges of things that did not belong to me, cool marble, dark wood, glass surfaces so clean they almost disappeared. Everything in this place felt permanent, untouched by the kind of life I came from, and that contrast settled under my skin in a way I could not ignore. I found the study by accident, or maybe not an accident at all. The door was slightly open, just enough to suggest I was allowed to see without being invited inside, and curiosity has always been my worst habit. I stepped in quietly, the room immediately different from the rest of the house, less polished, more lived in, shelves lined with books that looked read, not displayed, a desk that held papers instead of decoration, and behind it, a single photograph in a simple frame. No gold, no embellishment, just a moment captured and left there without explanation. Should have left, I knew that, but something about the simplicity of it drew me closer. The woman in the picture was smiling, not the kind of smile people wear for cameras, but something softer, real, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a younger Victor Kane, and that was the part that stopped me. Younger, yes, but more than that, different. There was something in his eyes I had not seen in the man at the table this morning, something unguarded, something human, and before I could think better of it, I heard his voice behind me, not loud, not sharp, just there. You should not be in here. I turned slowly, not startled, not exactly, but aware that I had crossed a line I did not fully understand. He stood in the doorway, the light from the hallway framing him in a way that made him look even more distant than before, and for a second, neither of us moved, his gaze shifting from me to the photograph, then back again, and something unreadable passed through his expression, not anger, not quite, but not indifference either. Then close the door next time, I said before I could stop myself. the words leaving my mouth softer than they felt in my chest. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to make me wonder if I had made a mistake, but instead of reacting the way I expected, he stepped into the room, slow, deliberate, like he had already decided how this moment would end. "This house has doors for a reason," he replied, his tone even. Controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, something closer to awareness. I held his gaze, not challenging, not backing down, just present, because if this was going to be my life, I needed to understand the rules behind it, not just follow them blindly. "And what happens when those doors are left open?" I asked, and this time, I saw it, the smallest shift in his posture, the faintest pause before he answered, like the question had reached somewhere he did not expect. "People forget their place," he said finally, and there it was again, that wordless line drawn between us, but this time it felt different, less like a wall and more like a boundary waiting to be tested. I glanced once more at the photograph before stepping past him, not rushing, not hesitating, just choosing to leave on my own terms, and as I walked out into the hallway, I felt his eyes on me, not dismissing, not ignoring, but following, and that was the moment I understood something had changed, not in him, not yet, but in the way he was starting to see me, because I was no longer just the girl who meant nothing, I was the question he did not have an answer for, and questions like that do not get ignored, they get watched. By the time evening settled over the house, I understood one thing with absolute clarity: nothing here happened by accident, not the open door, not the photograph, not even the silence that followed me from room to room like a shadow that refused to leave. I felt it in the way the staff moved slightly differently around me now, more aware, more careful, like word had already traveled through invisible channels that I had stepped somewhere I was not supposed to, and yet no one said anything. No one corrected me, which somehow felt more deliberate than if they had. I spent most of the afternoon in the sunroom, a space filled with light that did not quite reach the corners, sitting on a chair that faced the garden, watching a world that looked peaceful but felt curated, trimmed hedges, perfect lines, nothing out of place. It reminded me of him in a way I could not explain, controlled, contained, everything exactly where it should be, and I wondered what it would take to disrupt something like that, not destroy it, just shift it enough to make it real. I was still there when I heard footsteps behind me, not rushed, not hesitant, just present. I did not turn right away, I did not need to. I had already learned the rhythm of his presence, the way the air seemed to adjust when he entered a space. "You are not where you are expected to be," he said, his voice cutting clean through the quiet, and I let a small breath out before finally looking over my shoulder. "I did not realize I had a schedule," I replied, and for a second, I thought I saw it again, that flicker, not quite irritation, not quite interest, something in between that he did not bother to hide this time. He stepped further into the room, stopping just close enough to make the distance between us feel intentional. "There are expectations," he said, and I tilted my head slightly, studying him in a way I knew most people never dared to. "Yours or mine?" I asked, and that was when the silence shifted, not empty anymore, but charged, like something had just been placed between us that neither of us could ignore. He did not answer right away, which in itself felt like an answer, his gaze steady, measuring, and for the first time, I realized he was not just watching me, he was trying to understand me, and that realization settled somewhere deep, because understanding creates space, and space is where things change. "You are here for a reason," he said finally, and I stood up then, slowly, not to challenge him, but to meet him on equal ground, even if the world around us insisted we were not equals. "So are you," I said quietly, and for a moment, neither of us moved, the distance between us holding something unspoken, something neither of us had defined yet. Then he turned slightly, his attention shifting toward the garden like the conversation had already ended in his mind. "Dinner is at 7, he added, his tone returning to that controlled calm that made everything sound final, and I nodded once, not because I was agreeing, but because I was choosing which battles mattered. He left without another word, his footsteps fading into the quiet rhythm of the house, and I remained there for a long moment after he was gone, staring at the reflection of myself in the glass, faint against the darkening sky outside, and I realized something I had not expected to realize so soon. This was no longer just about surviving his world, it was about changing the way he saw it, because somewhere between the photograph in that study and the silence in this room, I had stopped being invisible, and the most dangerous thing about a man like Victor Kane is not what he controls, it is what he starts to notice, because once he notices, he does not look away, and I had just become something he could not ignore. 7 o'clock came with a precision that felt less like routine and more like control, the kind that does not need to be announced because everyone already knows it exists. I arrived at the dining room exactly on time, not early, not late, because I was starting to understand that in a place like this, timing was not about politeness, it was about position, and I refused to start at a disadvantage. He was already seated again, exactly where he had been that morning, like the day had folded in on itself and reset around him, the table set with the same careful detail, every piece placed with intention, every movement by the staff quiet and efficient, disappearing the moment their task was done. I took my seat across from him without waiting to be acknowledged, and for a brief second, I wondered if that would provoke a reaction, but he did not look up, not immediately. Instead he finished the page he was reading, turning it slowly before placing the document aside. Only then did his eyes meet mine, and there it was again, that pause, subtle but real, like he was recalibrating something he had not expected to change. Dinner was served without conversation, the soft clink of silverware the only sound between us, and I realized quickly that silence was not empty here, it was a tool, something he used with as much precision as anything else. Most people would have filled it, tried to ease it, but I did not. I let it sit, let it stretch, because I was beginning to understand that the only way to exist in his world was not to fight every rule, but to choose which ones to ignore. Halfway through the meal, I noticed one of the staff hesitate near the doorway, just for a second, long enough to draw my attention. She was younger than the others, maybe early 20s, her hands steady but her eyes uncertain, and when Victor spoke, it was not to her directly, but the effect was immediate. That is not how it is done, he said calmly, not raising his voice, not looking at her, and yet the room shifted, the air tightening in a way that made everything feel smaller. She corrected her movement quickly, nodding once before stepping back, and I felt something twist in my chest. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition, because I knew that feeling, the pressure of getting something wrong in a world that did not allow mistakes, and before I could stop myself, I set my fork down, the sound quiet but deliberate, and spoke. It seemed fine to me, I said, my voice even, not challenging, just present, and that was the moment everything stilled, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that it mattered. His gaze lifted slowly, not surprised, not offended, just focused, like I had just done something worth noticing. The staff member froze, unsure whether to move or stay, and for a second, I questioned my choice, but only for a second, because if I was going to exist here, I needed to decide what kind of person I would be inside these walls. Then you are not paying attention, he replied, his tone unchanged, but there was something sharper beneath it now, something directed, not at the staff, but at me, and instead of backing down, I held his gaze, steady, calm. Or maybe I am paying attention to something else, I said. And there it was again, that flicker, that brief shift in his expression that told me I had stepped outside the role he had assigned me. The silence that followed was different this time, not controlled, not comfortable, but alive, like it was waiting to see who would move first, and after a moment, he leaned back slightly, his attention returning to his plate as if the moment had passed, but I knew it had not, because the staff member moved again, slower this time, more careful, but not frozen. And something about that mattered more than anything he could have said. The rest of dinner continued without another word, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be undone, and as I stood to leave, I felt it again, his gaze following me, not dismissing, not indifferent, but aware in a way that felt new, because I had just done something no one here seemed to do. I had disrupted his control, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. And the most dangerous thing about disrupting a man like Victor Kane is not what happens in that moment, it is what happens after, because men like him do not forget. They observe, they adjust, and they decide. And as I walked out of that room, I realized something I had not allowed myself to admit before. I was no longer just surviving his world, I was starting to change it, and I had no idea yet whether that would save me or destroy me. The house felt different the next morning, not louder, not warmer, but aware in a way it had not been before, like something invisible had shifted overnight and every person inside it could feel the change without knowing exactly why. I noticed it in the way conversation stopped a fraction sooner when I entered a room, in the way eyes lingered just a second longer before looking away, and for the first time since I arrived, I realized I was no longer being ignored, I was being observed, and that was a far more dangerous position to hold. I did not see him at breakfast, which somehow felt intentional, like absence was another form of control, but his presence still existed in the details, the same precision, the same order, the same quiet expectation that everything would function exactly as it should. I ate slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, letting the silence settle around me without trying to fill it, because I was beginning to understand that silence here was not emptiness. It was space, and space could be used. After breakfast, I walked through the house again, but this time with purpose, not searching, not wandering, just learning. I memorized the turns of the hallways, the placement of doors, the rhythm of movement, because knowledge in a place like this was not optional, it was protection. I found myself back near the study without meaning to, or maybe I did mean to. The door was closed this time, firmly. No invitation, no gap, just a clear line that had been redrawn after yesterday, and instead of reaching for the handle, I stopped, respecting it in a way that felt like strategy rather than obedience. I turned away before anyone could tell me to, and that choice felt more powerful than crossing the line had. The afternoon passed with a quiet tension that never fully left, and by the time evening approached, I felt it again. That subtle shift in the air that told me he was near before I even saw him. I was standing by the window in the main hall, when his reflection appeared behind me in the glass, not close, not distant, just there, like he had always been part of the space. "You are learning," he said, his voice calm, but there was something different in it now, something less dismissive, more deliberate. I did not turn right away, keeping my eyes on the reflection instead of the man himself. "I am paying attention," I replied, and I saw it then, that same flicker, but stronger this time, less hidden, like he was no longer trying to pretend it was not there. He stepped closer, the distance between us narrowing just enough to change the weight of the moment. "That can be dangerous," he said, and I let out a quiet breath, not nervous, not uncertain, just aware of what this conversation really was, not a warning, not a threat, but a recognition. "Only if you are afraid of what you might see," I answered, and this time, he did not look away, his gaze steady, searching, like he was trying to place me somewhere in a system that did not have a category for what I was becoming. The silence stretched again, but it was not empty. It was full of something neither of us had named yet, something that felt less like control and more like tension, the kind that builds before something changes. Finally, he moved past me, his shoulder close enough to brush the air beside mine without touching, and for a brief second, I felt it, not contact, but presence. "Undeniable and real. Do not mistake attention for permission," he said as he walked away, his voice returning to that controlled calm, but the words lingered longer this time, not as a command, but as a line drawn between what was and what could be. I stayed where I was after he left, staring at my own reflection in the glass, and I realized something I had not expected to realize so soon. I was no longer just reacting to his world, I was shaping the way he responded to me, and that was a kind of power he had not planned for, because the moment someone like Victor Kane starts to adjust, even slightly, it means something has already changed, and change, no matter how small, never stops where it begins. The first real crack did not come from him, it came from the house, or more precisely, from the people inside it, because systems like this do not break from the top, they shift from the edges where pressure builds quietly, unnoticed until it is too late. I saw it late that afternoon, in the same hallway I had walked through a dozen times already. Everything looked the same at first glance, the polished floors, the controlled movement, the silence that felt rehearsed, but then I noticed her. Again, the same young staff member from dinner, the one who had hesitated. This time she was not just uncertain, she was anxious, her hands moving too quickly, her eyes flicking toward the staircase like she was waiting for something she did not want to face, and I should have kept walking. I knew that, because nothing in this house happened without consequence, but something in me refused to ignore it. Maybe because I remembered what it felt like to exist in a place where every mistake carried weight, or maybe because I was starting to understand that power here did not just come from him, it came from what everyone else allowed. "You are going to drop that," I said quietly as I stepped closer, her hands tightening around the tray she was carrying. she looked at me like I had just broken an unspoken rule, like I was not supposed to speak to her at all. "I am fine, Mrs. Kane," she replied quickly, the words practiced, automatic, but her voice did not match them, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and steadied the edge of the tray, just enough to stop the slight tremor, not touching her, not interfering, just present, and for a second, everything froze, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that I felt it, the shift in the air, the awareness that this moment was not as small as it seemed. "You do not have to pretend," I said softly, and her eyes met mine for the first time, really met them, not as an employee looking at an employer, but as a person trying to understand another person, and that was when I realized how rare that was in this house, how carefully human moments were kept out of it. "It is my first week," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, and I nodded once, because that explained everything, the hesitation, the tension, the fear of getting something wrong in a place that did not allow mistakes. "Then you are doing better than you think," I said, and the words felt simple, but here, they carried weight, because encouragement did not exist in systems built on control. It was not efficient, it was not necessary, and that was exactly why it mattered. She adjusted her grip on the tray, steadier this time, her shoulders relaxing just enough to be noticeable, and for a brief second, something in her expression shifted, not confidence, not yet, but relief, small and fragile, but real, and that was when I felt it again, that presence behind me, not loud, not announced, just there. I did not turn immediately, I did not need to, I already knew. "You are interfering," his voice came, calm, measured, but different this time, not distant, not detached, but focused, and slowly, I turned to face him, meeting his gaze without hesitation, because this moment was not about the staff member anymore, it was about what I had just chosen to do. "I am helping," I replied, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough to matter. His eyes shifted briefly to the girl, then back to me, assessing, calculating, like he was trying to understand something that did not fit into the structure he had built. "That is not your role," he said, and I felt it then, the line he was drawing, the boundary he expected me to respect, but instead of stepping back, I held my ground, not defiant, not aggressive, just steady. "Maybe that is the problem," I said quietly, and for the first time since I met him, something in his expression changed in a way that could not be hidden, not anger, not frustration, but something deeper, something unsettled, like I had just introduced a variable he had not accounted for. The girl moved away quickly after that, the moment dissolving as if it had never happened, but I knew better, because moments like that do not disappear, they linger, they shift things beneath the surface, and as I stood there, facing a man who had built his world on control, I realized something I had not fully understood until now. I was not just changing how he saw me, I was changing how his world functioned, even if only in small ways, and the most dangerous part of that was not what he would do next, it was what he was already starting to feel, because control is easy when nothing challenges it, but the moment something does, even quietly, it forces a choice: hold tighter or let something in. And as he looked at me in that silent hallway, I knew one thing for certain. Victor Kane was not used to either option, and that meant whatever came next, neither of us would be prepared for it. That night, the house did not return to normal, because something had already shifted too far to be undone. I felt it in the way the air seemed heavier, like every room was holding on to something unsaid, and even the silence no longer felt controlled, it felt watchful, like it was waiting for the next move. I stayed in my room longer than usual, not hiding, not retreating, just thinking, replaying the moment in the hallway, the look in his eyes when I refused to step back, because that had not been anger, it had been something far more complicated, something that did not belong in a world built on certainty, and that made it dangerous. I was standing by the window when I heard the knock, not loud, not hesitant, just precise, the same way everything about him was. I did not answer right away, letting the sound settle before I moved, because I was learning that timing mattered more than words here. When I opened the door, he was there, exactly as I expected, composed, controlled, but closer than he had ever been before, not physically, but in presence, like he had chosen this moment carefully. "You crossed a line today," he said, his voice calm, but it carried something beneath it now, something sharper, more personal, and I met his gaze without stepping back, because this was not a moment to retreat. You left it open, I replied, and for a second, the silence between us shifted again, not empty, but charged, like something unseen had just been acknowledged. His eyes held mine longer this time, not dismissing, not moving past me, but staying, searching, like he was trying to understand something he had not planned for. You assume too much, he said. Finally, and I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in clarity. No, I see too much, I answered, and that was when it happened, not loud, not obvious, but real. Something in his expression broke, not completely, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it, like a crack forming beneath something solid. He stepped closer then, just one step, but it changed everything. The space between us narrowing in a way that made the moment impossible to ignore. This house functions because people understand their place, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, and I felt the weight of those words, not as a rule, but as a belief he had built everything on. And slowly, I let out a breath, steady, controlled. Or maybe it functions because no one has ever questioned it, I said, and the silence that followed was different from anything before. It was not controlled, not measured, it was uncertain. And uncertainty does not belong in his world, which meant I had just brought something into it that did not fit. His gaze did not leave mine, not for a second, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, not just power, not just control, but conflict. Something internal, something he did not allow himself to show, but could not fully hide anymore, and that realization settled deep, because it changed everything. This was no longer just about boundaries or rules. It was about something shifting inside him, something he did not understand yet, and that made it unpredictable. Finally, he stepped back, the distance returning, but not completely, not the way it had been before. Be careful, he said, and this time, it did not sound like a warning. It sounded like something else, something closer to concern, even if he did not intend it to. And then he turned and walked away, his footsteps steady, controlled, like nothing had changed. But I knew better, because I had seen it, felt it, that moment where certainty cracked just enough to let something else through. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized something I had not fully understood until now. I was no longer just challenging his world, I was changing him, slowly, quietly, in ways he could not stop. And the most dangerous thing about changing someone like Victor Kane is not what they lose, it is what they might become when they start to feel something they have spent a lifetime controlling, because once that begins, there is no going back, only forward into something neither of us had planned for. The next morning did not begin with silence, it began with absence, and absence in a place like this was never accidental. I noticed it the moment I stepped into the dining room and found his chair empty, not delayed, not forgotten, just empty, like he had chosen not to be there, and that choice carried more weight than any words he could have said. I sat anyway, because routine was still part of the structure, and I was not here to break everything, only to understand what deserved to be broken. Breakfast passed quietly, but the house did not feel calm, it felt alert, like something had already happened beyond my reach, something I was not meant to see. And that was when I realized the limits of what I knew. I had been focused on him, on the man, on the control, but I had not fully considered the world that existed around him, the one that did not rely on silence, the one that moved beneath it. I spent the late morning walking the grounds outside, needing space that did not feel constructed, the air cooler, real in a way the inside of the house never was, the gravel path beneath my shoes uneven just enough to remind me that not everything here was perfect. And for the first time since I arrived, I allowed myself to breathe without measuring it. That was when I heard the voices, not loud, not aggressive, just urgent, coming from just beyond the garden wall. I did not move closer, I did not need to, the tone alone told me everything I needed to know. Something was wrong, not chaotic, not uncontrolled, but disrupted, and disruption in his world meant something had slipped, something had gone beyond his control. I stepped back slowly, choosing distance instead of curiosity, because I was beginning to understand that knowing too much here came with a cost I was not ready to pay. When I returned inside, the tension followed me, carried in the way the staff moved faster, quieter, like they were adjusting to something unseen, and by late afternoon, I felt it again, that shift in the air that told me he was back before I even saw him. I found him in the study this time, the door open again, but not as an invitation, more like a statement, and for a moment, I hesitated, not out of fear, but awareness. Before stepping inside, he was standing by the desk, not seated, not relaxed, his posture tighter than I had seen before, his focus somewhere distant. Even as he looked directly at me, "You should not be here," he said, but the words lacked the certainty they had before, and I took another step forward, because something had changed, and I needed to understand what. "Something happened," I said, not asking, just stating what was already clear, and for a second, he did not respond, his gaze shifting slightly, like he was deciding how much to reveal, or if he would reveal anything at all. "It is handled," he replied finally, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was reassuring, but because it was predictable. Control restored, order maintained, but I could see it now, the difference between control and certainty, and he was not as certain as he wanted to be. "You do not believe that," I said quietly, and that was when his attention sharpened, fully, completely, like I had just stepped into something deeper than before. "Be careful," he said again. But this time, the words carried something else, not just a warning, but a limit, a boundary he needed to reinforce, and I held his gaze, steady, because I understood that boundary now, not just where it was, but why it existed. "You told me I meant nothing," I said, my voice calm, controlled, "so why does it matter where I stand?" And the silence that followed was different from anything before. It was not controlled, not measured, it was real, because for the first time, I had said something that did not fit into his world at all, something that challenged the foundation of it, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. His expression did not change immediately, but I saw it again, that crack, deeper this time, not breaking, but shifting, like something inside him was being forced to adjust. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but more honest than anything he had said before. "Because you are starting to." He stopped there, just for a second, like the words had not fully formed, or like he was not ready to let them exist. Then he finished, "Because you are starting to matter more than you should." And that was the moment everything changed, not in the house, not in the world outside, but in the space between us, because I had not come here to matter, I had come here to survive. But somewhere between silence and resistance, between rules and questions, I had become something neither of us expected. And as I stood there, looking at a man who had spent his entire life controlling what mattered and what did not, I realized something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The moment someone who means nothing starts to mean something, nothing in that world stays the same. Not the rules, not the control, not even the man who built it. And that meant whatever came next, it would not be something he could command, it would be something he would have to face. And for the first time since this began, I was not afraid of that.